and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. On July 23rd, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on countries' obligations to address climate change under international law. Now, according to their unanimous ruling, nations can now be held accountable for their climate-harming practices, even if they haven't signed the Paris Agreement. Now, the ICJ ruling also links climate action to the protection and promotion of human rights, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So joining me on the show today to discuss this further is Professor Tan Sri Dr. Jamila Mahmud, Executive Director of the Sunway Centre for Planetary Health at Sunway University. She's also the founder of Mercy Malaysia, and in the last decade she has served in several leadership positions in the UN and in the Red Cross. And she was the 2019 recipient of the ASEAN Prize. It's an honor to have you in the studio with me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mel.
This ICJ advisory opinion, I've learnt that you have had a direct personal involvement in it. Can you tell us about that?
I can now. Well, in the last year, as you know, a group of law students, took up this issue to file a case in ICJ. At the time, I was contacted by the legal firm that was handling this case to provide an independent medical opinion on the impact of climate change on human health. So I provided that, and to my surprise, they really liked it and included it in the dossier for ICJ. So you would have seen that health is quite central to the case. I believe I'm one of maybe many people who have provided information and evidence of the impact of climate change on health.
Yeah. Can you tell us what you included in your submission?
Well, I included the general impact of climate change on health is broad. First of all, you have the direct impacts of climate crisis, for example, harm to people, injuries from flood and so forth, but also the effects of heat to every man, woman, child, on whether it is more cardiovascular events, heat strokes and so forth. But also something that people don't realize is the impact on pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, premature labor, and particularly for outdoor workers, many of whom are the most vulnerable, the lack of cooling stations, and women especially who try to drink less water because they don't want to go to the toilet frequently, they get very severe impacts of dehydration and heat. So I think on top of that, climate change also causes a change in patterns of disease. So vector-borne diseases, you will be seeing, for example, what is normally tropical diseases now arising in temperate countries, dengue in Texas, malaria in Washington, D.C., and probably the re-emergence of other diseases that we probably thought was dormant and not active, probably re-emerging again soon. So this whole pattern of zoonotic diseases, pandemics, new epidemic outbreaks, and so forth.
So you included that in your submission, and clearly the legal team thought it was important enough to include it. The ICJ confirming that it is part of the, need to be part of international law. The need for a safe, healthy, sustainable environment, it must be protected by governments now. Now that we have this landmark ruling that you must be so proud to have been part of, what was the most powerful signal to you from this ruling?
I think the most important thing is, when you have law, you must remember law is to protect citizens and people. So I think this ruling affirms that climate action is not just a moral or political issue. It is about a legal obligation under international law to protect the citizens of this world against the impact of climate change and the drivers of climate change that are actually causing all these problems. So for me, it is a signal to governments and businesses alike that climate inaction can now be challenged in the courts, and then opens this door to a greater accountability and transparency, something that we have been really really pushing for.
Yeah.
We know that the most powerful signal that this opinion sends is that the law is now on the side of the planet and the people. And it's time for governments, businesses to step up, sit up, pay attention, take notice of the so-called little people like us who are really suffering as a consequence.
Yeah. I mean, this landmark opinion is what it is. It's landmark. It was so important when it came out, and I think, coming from the world's highest court, it surprised me that in the days following, that there wasn't a lot of attention. It seemed to have come and go with very little public attention and political attention and policy attention.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think such a significant moment barely registered here?
I think it was really quite a breakthrough advisory opinion, and much of the media in the West has carried the stories, but Malaysia has been quite quiet. I wrote an op-ed in the newspapers. We have been talking about it. I think it's so important for us to understand this, because the implications on our government, on our businesses, is quite serious. I would like to think that the government sits up now, and whoever is drafting the climate law, the RUPIN, has to now take this into consideration. We have had some consultations on this law, public consultations, and I still think it lacks a real focus on human health and well-being. We have to take that into consideration. So I hope that with this ICJ advisory opinion, our lawmakers now can really re-look at this draft, which has not been endorsed yet. We have to strengthen it.
Do you think we've underestimated how much this ICJ advisory opinion raises the stakes for us? Is there given how much we spend on fossil fuel, we are a fossil fuel producing country, do you think we've just not understood how much impact this could have on our government and our policies and our finances?
I think, yes, I think to a point, I think it is not well understood, the legal implications of this, and probably a little, with so many things on the plate of governments, it loses sight that these things might come back and hit them, right? You're talking about young populations now who are more aware, right? Who know that they have a right to environmental, integrity and well-being. And Malaysians are suffering. Young people are really anxious about climate change. And some of the studies we've done has shown that, it's a significant number of young people who are affected. So it will not take long for a group of young people to come together and challenge the government because the evidence is too clear. We are seeing this now, even in Malaysia, we are worried about water shortages, we're looking at the potential of crop failures. All this will affect nutrition, will in fact impact everyone, well-being. We're seeing stunting in Malaysia. But on top of that as well, the climate anxiety and the heat itself, particularly heat, is going to take a lot of absenteeism. Absenteeism will happen. And again, I mentioned at the start, it's a very unbalanced impact. It will be those who are the most vulnerable, the ones working outdoors. And this means we have to look at migrant workers. We have to look at, how are we going to make sure they are also protected in a country where we're still quite reliant on migrant workers? That's
a really important point, because I think often when conversations around climate justice, we think about countries, right? Nation states that are most climate affected versus the most historical emitters, for instance. But you're going down deeper into the demographics of a population. Who's going to be more impacted? You even talked about the gendered impact of health on climate change on health, right? So we should be looking at how it affects people down to the local level.
At country level, one might argue that we are not the polluters, so to speak. It's the West, and therefore they need to pay. That's why there's a loss and damage fund being proposed by the COPs, and we're seeing that it's not funded. All right, it's not funded to the extent that it should be funded. So this compensation to poor countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, was suffering year in and year out floods and cyclones that devastate the entire nation. But even for Malaysia, I think let's not be complacent. We are a small nation, but our emissions, even though it's 0.7%, if you look at per capita emissions, we're still quite high. So everyone has a role to reduce emissions, every country, every person, right? But one of the things I will say is that at the end of the day, it's about people, because the people build the nation. The people are responsible for driving economy. And you know, they are your citizens. They're the ones who vote for governments. So if they are going to be so badly impacted, there will be a direct impact on governments as well, and to our economy. I think that, you know, the data that we are seeing, particularly from the UK Actuarial Society, is showing that we have breached 1.5. We will touch 2 degrees by 2037. And when that happens, it's no longer climate change, it's climate chaos. Already we're seeing, you know, the newspapers sharing how heat waves are coming one after the other in Europe, and loss of about 87% of property by wildfires. Spain is on fire right now. And the impact of that burning of the bush and the forest is very severe on health. They're finding that the smoke that you're inhaling from burning forests, including the haze that we are inhaling, is worse than what we expected. It will have very severe consequences on our health, not just respiratory, right up to Alzheimer's.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you had written an opinion piece on this. And in that piece, you wrote, if I may quote you, you said, foot dragging is no longer morally or legally defensible.
Yeah.
I wanted to get you to elaborate on that. Who exactly has been foot dragging here? Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what foot dragging looks like and why it's no longer morally defensible. You mentioned that in the beginning as well.
So I think the opinion itself carries not just a justice piece, which is intergenerational justice for people, right? But also moral and political obligations, right? We have to look at mitigation, adaptation, but we also have to turn the tap off, and that tap is fossil fuels, right? We know we need to have a safe and just transition, and having a safe and just transition doesn't mean you drag it for a long, long time. You've got to accelerate it, right? The renewable energy sector must accelerate. Around the world now, people are almost totally running on renewable fuel. We have enough expertise in this country and enough resources to drive renewable energy. I think what we need to do is be very clear that some of the decisions we make will have impact. One of them, of course, is fossil fuel subsidies, which has been mentioned in the ICJ ruling that states can be held accountable as well on fossil fuel subsidies. It's explicit in the advisory. And we know, for example, in Malaysia, I have some data that, you know, the fossil fuel subsidies, I think, is to, let me gather the data, probably around the cost to health is about, it can range between $12 to $28 billion per year from premature death. And then you've got the cost, the subsidies, which are slightly lower than that. But that means you use these subsidies to provide people access to fuel, which actually has harm to their health. Rather than that, why not channel that funding towards accelerating renewables, making sure there's good infrastructure for public transport. So I think there are many ways that we can rethink how we go through this transition in a much more rapid way, but also one that's fair to human beings, right? Fair to our health.
So just transition doesn't mean a prolonged transition.
No.
And you're absolutely right. So we had recently, I think it was a few weeks ago, last month, where the Prime Minister made the special announcement. He said RON 95 petrol prices will remain or will be lower in September. And that comes just, you know, in the same breath of us being net zero targets, right? These contradictions of the country, what does it tell you about where our priorities are, both economic and emissions? Because subsidies, as you said, it's political capital will be sacrificed if subsidies are sacrificed.
So I have the numbers now. The fossil fuel industry, the subsidies are about 38.2 billion between 2022 to 2024, right? And the fossil fuel related air pollution costs this country between 12 to 28 billion annually through premature deaths. So basically, you know, you're given a subsidy of 38 billion and you spend about 28 billion on the cost of health. So, you know, wouldn't it have been better to use that money to improve health infrastructure, improve road transportation, accelerate renewables, and getting people, you know, access to that, you know, transportation and whatever they need for the fossil fuels for. So a rewiring of how we behave, right? How we act, how we use public transportation and so forth. So I think, you know, you mentioned it's political capital, and we all know that, you know, these are the decisions that some governments will make. And at the same time, I think, you know, yes, we have the National Energy Transition Roadmap. It's a place to start. But it still proposes quite a substantial share of fossil fuels in the mix, right? So can we accelerate that? Can we really pivot to this? And I'm not a fan of carbon capture, utilization, and storage because, you know, it's unproven, and the cost of that is detracting us from addressing the root cause of the problem. So I think, I just feel, I'm really sorry to say this, but I think that we might not be heading the direction that we want to actually achieve our commitments to net zero. Because if we want to seriously do that, we need to align both the ambition and policy pathways, right? So that we can actually get there.
Tan Sri, given this ruling now, that it's international law, and hopefully that when we have this climate change law, it will take into account what the ICJ has said. Could we then see a future where the government or policymakers that prioritize fossil fuel subsidies could be held to account for climate-related damage?
The ICJ advisory clearly and explicitly states that member states can be held account on fossil fuel subsidies that could potentially harm people. This actually, the evidence is very clear. The World Bank has come up with data, IMR has come up with data, how much fuel subsidies against the cost of health. In Malaysia itself, between 2022 to 2024, our spend on fuel subsidies was in the region of 38 billion ringgit. But the cost to health at the same time was between 12 to 28 billion per annum, which is from premature deaths and other health consequences. So in other words, with the subsidies, you're actually also causing more deaths and spending money that could have in the first place been spent to improve health infrastructure, to improve public transportation, accelerate our renewable energy pathway rather than on fossil fuel subsidies. But these are decisions that our policymakers and our political leaders have to make.
Can we talk about the trickle down from governments, right? So policymakers make these decisions, but they're also in charge of regulating corporate emitters.
Yeah.
How might that trickle down, the ICJ ruling, trickle down to the private sector?
Okay. With the ICJ advisory, what will happen is that, you know, there are clear science-based limits. Scientists are now stepping up to say, hang on a minute, you know, we know the science. It's been so clear. We need hard caps on carbon dioxide emissions, not just CO2, methane and other black carbon and all the other nitrous oxides and so forth, all the toxins, and no offset loopholes, right? This is one of the things that, you know, a lot of people are saying, oh, we just offset it. But that's a loophole because, you know, at the end of the day, you don't reduce the amount of emissions and routine compliance. I think it's not just about compliance, it's about really understanding there has to be a significant shift in how we generate energy and how we consume energy. It's not just, we'll continue consuming in an exponential way if we don't start changing the way we live, right? Mandatory disclosure and liability, I think that, you know, audited emissions, methane, climate risk reporting, I think with penalties that accompany for misreporting and legal exposure for harms. So I think the ICJ opinion strengthens the case that persistent failures to prevent climate harm can constitute an internationally wrongful act.
Wow.
And raising the stakes for both states and via domestic law, the companies as well, right? So I think this will actually push for real accountability, which means that polluters have to pay for compensation for health-related damages. So, you know, and the health industry will now have to play a very important role in actually calculating the cost. WHO is doing it.
Right.
There are many bodies that are now taking health as the central part of it.
Okay, that does, I do wonder, Tan Sri, would a public health framing maybe make politicians or make Malaysians sit up and take notice? Is there more of an urgency whenever, because we've just come out from the pandemic, right? Do you think there's more of an urgency if we get people to connect, and policymakers connect the dots between all these extreme weather patterns, the air pollution, food scarcity, food security, and our own health and safety?
Infectious diseases as well,
Correct,
right?
yeah.
And mental health and others. I think, yes, this is why, I'm a proponent of planetary health. It is, at the core of it is public and global health, but recognizing that health doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires the natural systems around it. We will not be healthy unless the planet is healthy. And the minute the planet turns unhealthy, the health impacts on us just escalate. And these things were not recognized in the past. We talk about lung cancer, for example. There are more lung cancers now that are non-tobacco related because of pollutants in the air. So things like this are not spoken of enough. For example, acceleration of Alzheimer's, infertility, things like cardiovascular diseases and strokes. These are all now related to heat and pollution. So then there's new evidence. I talked about fertility problems. I talked about miscarriages, about loss of pregnancies. So there's a wide range of things. And then there's the indirect with the crop failures, malnutrition, and so forth, right? But don't forget, looming behind this, the climate change doesn't happen also without biodiversity loss. There are two sides of a coin. Because you lose biodiversity, you've lost the ability to absorb CO2. You've also lost the ability to capture water. And therefore, the zoonotic leaks will happen, the transmission of diseases and so forth.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation, you mentioned climate anxiety.
Yes.
And I do think a lot of people feel this. Talk to me a little bit about that. When you are faced with climate anxiety or climate anxious people, what do you say to them? And I also do want to highlight the fact that this ICJ case was driven by young people, young Pacific Islanders.
Yes.
So talk to me about climate anxiety, but in the context of where climate leadership is coming from today.
You and I, when we hear the thunder outside, we already worry about how we're going to get home. Will the traffic be bad? That's a source of anxiety as well. But for young people, they're seeing this unfolding, that their future is actually one that might not even be inhabitable. So when we talk to young people, and at our center, we run something called Climate Courage workshops. We frame it in a positive way. We tell them, you are courageous, you are strong. This is not just doom and gloom. There are solutions. There is enough science, there's enough knowledge, there's enough innovation, and there are enough resources if we want to do a concerted effort now to deal and tackle with the climate crisis. So giving them that assurance and giving them tips on what to do, right? Talk to someone, recognize the most important is self-awareness. Are you anxious? What are you doing when you're anxious? Are you talking to someone about it? Who can you reach out to? Getting them to have little focus groups, to support each other. And then, getting them to do climate positive action so that they feel that they can be part of the solution. This is just indirect therapeutic kind of group therapy for young people, but ultimately, states and businesses have to be responsible and really ensure that, the future of these young people, the future generations that will be here, will not inherit a place that is so unsafe for them. And that whole concept of intergenerational justice, I always tell people, how will you answer when a person in the future turns back to you and says, you knew this was happening, what did you do? What is your legacy on this earth, that when you knew the world was falling apart because the climate was in chaos, because there was so much deforestation, there was too much fossil fuels, what did you do?
We have to answer that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you have a climate courage workshop, and I think that's a wonderful, hopeful note to end this conversation on. Thank you so much for being on the show with me. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening.